With the Republic of Turkey just reaching its 100th birthday, I figured it'd be a great time to do a scenario on what if the Ottoman Empire survived. So remember to like the video and subscribe. The Ottoman Empire was one of the longest lasting and most influential empires in history, ruling over land on 3 continents and being the leader of the Islamic world for centuries. The Ottomans began to seriously decline, however, in the 1800s, being dubbed the sick man of Europe. Over the course of the 1800s, the Ottomans lost their Balkan territories to independence movements and would lose their North African possessions to the European powers. This would relegate the Ottomans to the Turkish heartland in Anatolia and their Arabian possessions in the Middle East. However, hope was not lost in the empire, and attempts to reform the military and centralize the remaining territories seemed to be a promising chance to regain some power and turn the tides back in the empire's favor. But this would all be lost when the Ottomans entered World War I in 1914 on the side of the Central Powers. Over the course of the war, the Ottomans would be pushed out of the Middle East by the British and their Arab rebel allies, and by the end of the war, the Ottomans would find themselves forced to accept the partition of their lands by the European powers, leading to the ultimate demise of the 700-year-old empire and the birth of the modern Republic of Turkey. But what if the Ottoman Empire had stayed out of the war and continued to focus on their military and political reforms? How would the history of the Middle East and the wider world have changed if the Ottoman Empire had survived? In our timeline, the Ottomans joined World War I due to an incident in the Black Sea where the war minister Enver Pasha colluded with the German Navy using some newly purchased German ships that were still crewed by their German sailors to surprise attack Russian positions in the Black Sea. This attack was done without the approval of the government, which supported neutrality at the time, and Pasha acted independently with the Germans to force the Ottomans into the war against the Allies. But what if this was prevented and the Ottomans maintained their neutrality in the conflict, which is what the majority of the government wanted to do, even in our timeline? Well, for one, the scenario of the Ottomans staying out of the war seemed much more likely to happen in real life compared to what happened in our timeline. So let's start at the end of World War I, which would still end in 1918 in this timeline. So what would the situation of the Ottoman Empire be in 1918 if they had stayed out of World War I? The government of the Ottomans at this time was run by the nationalist Young Turks who had staged coups in 1908 and 1913, so by the end of World War I, their position would be more secure than in our timeline due to maintaining neutrality in the war. The Young Turks were initially secular, but over time took a more Islamist approach, especially during the war in our timeline, perpetuating atrocities against Christian Greeks and Armenians during the war in our timeline. The government supported policies of Turkification, which sought to force the Turkish language and Islam on the Christian populations in the empire. This would still occur in this timeline, although not to such a violent extent as during World War I in our timeline. These policies would not be as focused on the Arabs as they were already Islamic, although the Turkish language would still be promoted in the Arab regions of the empire, especially after the discovery of oil in Ottoman Iraq and Arabia in the early 1920s. This discovery of oil would be a godsend to the empire and would cause the empire to take a much more active hand in the Arabian Peninsula, settling more Turks in Iraq and Arabia and making deals with both the BP and Shell corporations to help extract the oil, like the Saudis did in our timeline. The Ottomans would crush the fledgling Saudi state, taking over all of Arabia except for the British colonies in the Gulf. This would be relatively easy for the Ottomans as the Saudis were incredibly primitive and few in number, and faced with the might of the reformed Ottoman army, having received equipment and training from both Britain and Germany, the Saudis would be completely crushed. The defeat of the Saudis would also slow down the tide of radical Islam from developing, as the Saudis in our timeline, being followers of the radical Wahhabist school of Sunni Islam, would go on to use their vast oil wealth to fund Islamist groups across the Muslim world, which would not occur in this timeline with the Ottomans promoting their traditionally less radical form of Sunni Islam. And with the Ottoman Sultan retaining his position as caliph, the Ottomans would remain as the dominant Islamic authority across the world. The abolishment of the caliphate is something that is somewhat overlooked when talking about the collapse of the Ottomans in our timeline, but this was a massive destabilizing force on the entire Muslim world, as the caliph was the spiritual and political leader of all Muslims from the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad until the abolishment of the position by the first president of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, in 1924, as he wished to turn Turkey into a secular Western republic. This would cause shockwaves through the Muslim world for the next 100 years, as it would be like if the Pope was abolished for the Catholics, for example. This is why we see Islamist groups like ISIS proclaim new caliphates, as the role has been empty for the last 100 years, and many radical groups wish to fill that void. In this timeline, this would not happen, as the Sultan would retain the position of Caliph like the Sultans before him, as the Ottomans had held the position since 1517, when the Ottomans captured the holy cities of Mecca and Medina from the Mamluks. During the interwar years, the Ottomans would maintain their neutrality, working to continue centralizing their state and continuing to work on industrialization and ramping up their extraction of their vast oil resources, causing the economy to boom. They would use this money to strengthen their industry, just like the Turkish government did in our timeline. And with this massive boost in wealth and population compared to the Turkey of our timeline, this would have been even more successful, with cities like Istanbul and Baghdad becoming major industrial hubs. They would also use this money to continue building up their military, buying new ships and equipment, and expanding their military to maintain more control and defend their oil fields in Arabia. The Ottomans would be one of the less affected nations by the Great Depression, similar to the Saudis of our timeline, and while the economic growth would still slow down, the oil boom would still be in full effect, keeping the economy stable through the 1930s. The Ottomans' international relationships would be complicated. They would have a very poor relationship with the Soviet Union because of the Soviet oppression of Muslim and Turkic peoples and the Soviet policies of exporting communist revolutions to neighboring states. They would have a business relationship with America like the Saudis in our timeline did, but they would not have strong political ties. In terms of the Western powers, they would have an interesting relationship with Britain, as they would be their largest trading partner. However, the British owned former Ottoman lands in Cyprus and Egypt, which the Ottomans would still have interest in. They would also have poor relations with the French due to their harsher treatment of their Muslim subjects across their African colonies. They would have good relations with Germany, being large customers of German military equipment, and would hire German officers to train their troops, similarly to what the Chinese did in our timeline. They would also share fear of the Soviet Union, and the Germans would be one of the largest customers of Ottoman oil. The relations with the Italians would be similar to the relationship with Britain, doing business but remembering the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, where the Italians seized Libya and the Isle of Rhodes and humiliated the Ottomans internationally. They would maintain good relations with neighboring Persia, as they would be a large trading partner and a good ally to check Soviet expansion into the Middle East. Finally, the Balkans, where they would have extremely poor relations with Greece, having constant border skirmishes and clashes in the Aegean over islands and maritime borders. With the beginning of World War II, the Ottomans would be in a very strong position, having gone through decades of military, economic, and political reform. The Ottomans would find themselves in a key position as one of the biggest oil producers of the world, and with a key geographic location in the center of the map. The government would initially remain neutral through the beginning of the war, watching as the Germans swept across Poland and France. They would watch as the Italians would struggle against the British in North Africa, and would see their Balkan neighbors of Bulgaria and Romania join the Axis as well. And shortly after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Ottomans would receive an offer from Germany to join the war on their side. The Germans would offer all British colonies in the Middle East, giving the Ottomans the option to unify the Arabian Peninsula under their rule. They would offer lands in the Caucasus, as well as the establishment of a united Turkestan in Central Asia, which would be made into an Ottoman puppet state. They would also offer Greek islands, including Crete, as well as British Cyprus. But the greatest prize the Germans would offer to the Ottomans would be British Egypt, including full control over the Suez. This offer would still be being discussed by the Ottoman government when in the summer of 1941 the British and Soviets would launch a surprise joint invasion into Persia to occupy the country. This would force the Ottomans to act, fearing the same could happen to them, and in August of 1941 the Ottoman Empire would declare war on the British and the Soviets, joining the war on the side of the Axis powers. The Ottomans would act quickly, sending some troops to aid the Italians and Bulgarians in their occupation of Greece, and they would reinforce their defensive lines on their Soviet border in the Caucasus. And they would also start a major offensive in Egypt, seizing the Suez right across the border from the Ottoman-controlled Sinai Peninsula. This would actively split the British Empire in two, as now the British would have to sail all around Africa to reach India, and this would also force the British into a two-front war in Egypt, with the Ottomans in the east and the Italian and German forces pushing west from Libya. After the seizure of Egypt, other British Mediterranean territories would fall to the Ottomans and Italians, with Italy seizing Malta and the Ottomans taking Cyprus. The partition of Egypt by Italy and the Ottomans would cause some strain between the two Axis nations, as the Italians dreamed of dominating the whole Mediterranean. The Ottomans and Italians would also have disputes in Greece as well, which would need to be mediated by Germany, with the Ottomans facing invasions from Britain and Arabia and preparing for an invasion of the Soviet Caucasus with the Germans. They would have to wait to settle these disputes with the Italians until after the war, with the Italians themselves having to do the same, as they would still be fighting the British in sub-Saharan Africa over Ethiopia. After victory in Egypt, the Ottomans would redirect some troops from Egypt to the Arabian front, where they would have lost control of their Gulf territories to the British, and would be fighting tooth and nail to keep the British away from Baghdad and resecure their southern oil reserves. They would use the reinforcements from Egypt to start a new offensive, which would be successful in pushing the British out of Kuwait, and the Ottomans would be able to resecure their precious oil fields in Arabia, capitalizing on the British loss of Suez, which would make reinforcing their Arabian colonies much more challenging. With the British losing their mainland Arabian territories and losing control of Yemen and Oman, as well as the Emirates, but the British would be able to maintain control of their island territories in the Gulf, including Bahrain. The Ottomans would be able to supply Germany with a massive amount of oil, which would cause the German offensive in Russia to be even faster than in our timeline, and after a joint invasion of the Caucasus by the two powers, the Germans and the Ottomans would be able to secure the region, which would give the Axis even more oil for the war effort. And after the expulsion of the Soviets from the Caucasus and the British from Arabia, the Ottomans would be able to liberate Persia, which would then join the Axis. With the Caucasus firmly under Axis control, the Germans would be in the process of pushing the Soviets back to the Urals by the end of 1943, and the Ottomans would fund local rebellions in Central Asia to establish their Turkestan puppet state, which would prove somewhat successful in establishing a state in the south of Central Asia, with the Soviets retaining control over Kazakhstan. The year coming to a close, the British would find themselves kicked out of the Mediterranean and Arabia, and with the growing fear of a revolt in India, the British would seek an armistice with Germany at the beginning of 1944. The Germans would agree to peace with the British, as they would find themselves in an incredibly bloody and seemingly endless war with the Soviet Union in the east. The whole Axis would make peace with Britain, except for Japan, because Britain still supported America in their fight with the Japanese in Asia and the Pacific, and the Japanese refused to make peace, seeking to keep British colonies they seized in Asia and dreaming of pushing further into India. The Treaty of Paris would be signed in 1944 and would see Axis domination over Europe and the Middle East being recognized by Britain, with Britain losing its Middle Eastern colonies and Cyprus to the Ottomans, and losing some African colonies to the Germans and Italians, who would also take Malta. The British would also be forced to recognize these border changes in Europe as well, which would see Ottoman seizure of Cyprus, as well as the annexation of Crete, part of Thrace, and some Aegean islands from Greece. The Ottomans would also annex the southern Caucasus from the Soviet Union as well. After the Treaty of Paris, these would be the new borders of the Ottoman Empire. They would have expanded into Egypt, Arabia, Greece, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean, and they would now have complete control over the Suez, Arabia, the eastern Mediterranean, and they would also have their puppet state of Turkestan in Central Asia. And this will be the state of the world in the same year. World War II in the Pacific, however, would follow the same path as our timeline, with the Americans pushing the Japanese back to their home islands and still using the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Americans would also not be present at the Treaty of Paris in 1944 and would maintain a state of war with the Axis powers. However, the only nation they would be actively fighting would be the Japanese. The Americans would not be fighting the Axis in Europe like in our timeline, with them having nowhere to land troops in this timeline. However, they would maintain the Lend-Lease program for the Soviets, continuing to supply them with weapons and equipment to fight the Germans. After the fall of the Japanese, the Americans would be able to set up democratic states in Japan and in a united Korea, with the Soviets still being focused on the Germans. They would also be able to set up democratic states in former French colonies in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, as the Free French government in exile in Africa would be too weak to maintain them as colonies. The British colonies in Asia would be returned, and the Philippines granted independence. Most importantly, the Americans would also be more successful in supporting the nationalists against the communists in the Chinese Civil War, leading to a diplomatic falling out between America and the Soviets, as the Soviets would still support the communists in the Civil War against the American-supported nationalists. This would lead to the Americans stopping the Lend-Lease program sometime in 1947 and signing a white peace with Germany and the other Axis powers that same year. And thus this would be the state of the world in 1950. The Americans and British would be in a Cold War with Germany, with the Americans propping up the British Empire as an additional counterweight to the Axis, and would help the British maintain control in their colonies as opposed to their anti-colonial stance of our timeline. The Anglo-American sphere of influence would include most of East Asia, the Americas, and parts of Africa. The Axis would maintain a shaky peace in Europe, with the Germans finally pushing the Soviets out of Europe across the Ural Mountains by 1949. However, the Axis powers would have serious disputes with each other, with Italy and Bulgaria having disputes with the Ottoman Empire over Greece and the Mediterranean, and Germany having to constantly mediate these disputes between the lesser Axis nations. The Axis sphere of influence would include Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Finally, the Soviet Union, who would be the last and most fragile piece in this three-way Cold War, as it would be confined to the Asian side of the Urals in Siberia and Kazakhstan, and would maintain a puppet state in Mongolia. Their goals would be to ignite communist rebellions across the world, especially in Asia and in the European colonies in Africa. Their ultimate goal, of course, would be the reconquest of their old European heartland from Germany, and would fund and arm rebels across the German Reich in hopes of reclaiming their lands and spreading communism. The Soviets and the Germans would also acquire nuclear weapons by the early 1950s, and thus this unstable three-way Cold War would lead to the world being on the constant brink of nuclear annihilation. Would the Axis collapse to infighting? Would the British lose their colonies to communist revolts? Or would the world end in nuclear apocalypse? This will be left to you to decide. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks again for making it to the end of the video. And thank you guys for all the support on my first video. This is only my second video, but I have plans to have a new one out every week, so remember to stay tuned and have a good one.